In 2004, the tiny Caribbean nation of Antigua and Barbuda won a legal battle at the World Trade Organization against the United States over online gambling. And while the United States never fully complied, the ruling gave Antigua the legal right to suspend American intellectual property rights, a startling move in global trade law. Fast forward to 2019, and a Swedish teenager, Greta Thunberg, helped launch a global climate movement. Her protests led millions of students around the world to walk out of school in what became known as Fridays for Future, demanding action from governments and shaking the agenda of major international climate summits. So here's a question. Can small actors actually be powerful? And if so, how? When we talk about power in international relations, we're not always talking about tanks, missiles, or the economy. Sometimes we're talking about something else entirely. Hey everyone, I'm Noah Zerbe. I'm a professor of international relations at Cal Poly Humboldt, and in this video, we're going to unpack what power really means in global politics. Those stories of Antigua at the WTO and the student-led climate strikes might seem like exceptions to the rule, but they highlight something important. Power in international relations isn't always about the size, strength, or military might. In fact, if you take one big idea from this video, it's this. Power comes in many forms, and understanding these forms is key to making sense of global politics. At its core, power is about influence. In political science, we often define power as the ability of one actor to shape the behavior or outcomes of another. Or as the political scientist Harold Lasswell famously put it, politics is about who gets what, when, and how. That's why political science is often called the study of power. Whether we're looking at campaigns, constitutions, revolutions, or foreign policy, we're really asking who has power, how is it exercised, and who benefits or suffers from its use. One of the most influential definitions of power comes from the American political scientist Robert Dahl, who put it simply, A has power over B to the extent that A can get B to do something that B would not otherwise do. Think about that for a second. It doesn't require force. It could be persuasion, pressure, or even inspiration. The key idea is causing change in someone's behavior. But that raises an important distinction, that of power as capability versus power as outcome. Power as capability refers to the resources available to an actor, the things that give it the potential to influence others. These might include military capabilities, economic prowess, population demographics, geographic advantages like control over oceans or strategic choke points, control over natural resources like oil or rare earth minerals, and so on. But having significant military or economic capabilities, like nuclear weapons or large armies, doesn't guarantee outcomes. North Korea, for example, possesses nuclear weapons but faces isolation and limited global influence. In other words, having power capabilities doesn't guarantee influence. That's where outcomes matter. Power as outcome refers to an actor's actual ability to shape events, behaviors, or decisions, regardless of its raw capabilities. A country might have lots of resources, but fail to achieve its goals, maybe because of poor strategy, domestic constraints, or international pushback. Despite its enormous military capabilities, for example, the United States was ultimately unable to prevent the Taliban's return to power in Afghanistan. Its outcome power, its influence over events, was limited. On the flip side, smaller states can sometimes achieve significant power outcomes with far fewer capabilities, perhaps through diplomacy, alliances, or control over key resources. For example, Qatar, a small nation with a tiny population, exerts major influence on regional diplomacy thanks to its strategic gas reserves, media influence, particularly through Al Jazeera, and its diplomatic agility. In international relations, scholars usually talk about two main kinds of power. Hard power is about coercion, using force or payments to get what you want. We most often associate hard power with military force or the threat of attacks, but it can also include things like economic sanctions and trade embargoes, limiting access to strategic resources, freezing assets, or imposing travel bans. So when the United States imposes asset freezes or trade embargoes to pressure other countries, or when Russia uses military force in Ukraine, both are employing hard power strategies. But power isn't always about threats or weapons. Hard power is most effective when the threat or promise is credible and when it's used in pursuit of a clear, well-defined objective. That said, hard power is often ineffective, especially in the face of a strongly motivated opponent. Soft power, a term coined by Joseph Nye, refers to the ability to shape preferences through attraction and persuasion. It's about cultural influence, diplomacy, moral authority, and global reputation. There are lots of examples of soft power. When people around the world adopt Korean pop music, watch American or Bollywood films, or admire Nordic social policies, that's soft power at work. So too are educational exchange programs. Soft power is most effective when perceived as legitimate and authentic. The message or cultural export is not imposed but is voluntarily embraced, and the source of soft power aligns its actions with its values. Otherwise, it becomes hypocrisy and loses influence. Hard power, in other words, forces others to act, while soft power makes them want to act. Of course, most states don't rely on just one type of power. Rather, success in global politics often depends on using both hard and soft power strategic, something Nye calls smart power. We can see smart power across global politics. At the start of the U.S. military operations in Afghanistan in the early 2000s, for example, the United States shifted away from initial military-only strategies to incorporate soft power strategies like development aid, cultural diplomacy, and nation-building efforts. While it continued to rely on hard power, for example, drone strikes, special forces raids, continued military presence, and training of local forces, economic sanctions targeting terrorists, financing, and so on, it also made increasing use of soft power tools like humanitarian assistance, reconstruction programs, support for civil society, promoting education and gender equality, establishing partnerships with local media and religious leaders, and engaging in public diplomacy campaigns to counter extremism. While mixed in its effectiveness, this shift acknowledged that the legitimacy and persuasion were crucial to long-term success. The United States recognized that military force alone couldn't defeat the Afghan insurgency, and it combined security operations with efforts to win local support, promote development, and reshape political institutions. China's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, provides another example of smart power. The BRI is a massive infrastructure and investment program spanning Asia, Africa, and Europe. China uses the initiative to expand its economic, geopolitical, and cultural influence, employing both soft and hard power tactics, often in tandem. On the hard power side, the Chinese government uses the strategic infrastructure investments in ports, railways, and highways, sometimes creating debt and development dependence in recipient countries. It also establishes military bases and security cooperation agreements. And on the soft power side, the Confucius Institute promotes Chinese language and culture. Scholarship and academic exchange programs with BRI countries aim to establish a positive view of the country. Health diplomacy, for example, through the provision of personal protective equipment and vaccine distribution during the COVID-19 pandemic, is another example of soft power. And media partnerships through state-backed outlets like CGTN seek to shape the global narrative. Through this combination, reflective of a smart power strategy, China isn't just building infrastructure, it's building influence, using economic leverage, a form of hard power, to create dependency and political goodwill, while also cultivating a positive image of China as a development partner, a form of soft power. And the combination has allowed China to challenge U.S. hegemony in many parts of the global south without direct military confrontation. Beyond asking how power is applied through force or persuasion, IR scholars also explore where power operates, in direct interactions, in rules and institutions, in global structures, and even in the way we talk about the world. And in doing so, we arrive at four broad typologies of power. Compulsory power is the most direct and visible form of power. It happens when one actor uses force or threats to control the behavior of another. Think of military invasions, economic sanctions, or coercive diplomacy. For example, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, it used compulsory power, military force, to try to change Ukraine's behavior and alignment. Similarly, when the United States imposed crippling sanctions on Iran to pressure it to stop uranium enrichment, that too was compulsory power. Institutional power operates through rules, procedures, and norms established in international institutions like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, or even trade agreements. Here, power doesn't work through direct coercion, but through agenda setting, rule writing, and access control. Think about how the United States and the European Union wield significant institutional power through the International Monetary Fund, which often ties lending to specific economic reforms, or how permanent members of the UN Security Council can veto any resolution, giving them disproportionate power in global diplomacy. Both of these are examples of institutional power. Structural power is more invisible. It shapes the positions and roles actors occupy within the international system itself, determining who gets what, who matters, and who doesn't. It's about how the global economy, state system, or class relations create long-term inequalities and dependencies. Consider, for example, how former colonial powers often maintain economic dominance over their former colonies through global trade structures and financial institutions, even without direct control. Or how countries in the global south are structurally disadvantaged in WTO negotiations due to limiting bargaining power and dependence on exports or raw materials. Or how the United States can use its control of the dollar to influence the global economy. All of these are examples of structural power. And the last is productive power. Productive power is the most subtle and abstract, but it's also one of the most influential. It's about the power to shape meaning, identity, and perception through discourse. This kind of power determines what counts as legitimate, who gets to define the problems, and which narratives dominate international debates. Consider, for example, how the global war on terror framed some actors as freedom fighters and others as terrorists, even while their methods or goals overlapped. Or how the language of developed versus developing countries implies a hierarchy, even though those categories are socially constructed. As we'll consider in another video, productive power is central to constructivist theories of international relations, which emphasize that ideas, norms, and identities shape international behavior. Understanding these dimensions helps us see that power isn't just about weapons or money. It's about how systems, institutions, and ideas shape what's possible in global politics. And when we analyze international events, it's useful to ask not just how much power an actor has, but what kind of power they're using. So, why does all this matter? Because in international relations, power is the foundation, not just of conflict and cooperation, but of everything in between. Power determines who sets the global agenda and what issues get prioritized, who gets heard and who gets ignored, whose voices are amplified in diplomacy, institutions, and the media, and who defines the rules of the international order from trade and security to human rights and environmental standards. Understanding power helps us ask deeper questions. Why are some states able to act with impunity while others face consequences? Who benefits from the way the international system is structured? And who has the ability to change it? These questions aren't just theoretical. They shape everything from who enforces sovereignty to how we define legitimacy to whether the global order is fair and sustainable. And as we look to the future, we'll keep returning to these themes: how power is shifting in a more multipolar world, what happens when emerging powers like China or India challenge global norms, and how do non-state actors, from multinational corporations to social movements, exert power and influence over traditional state power. So, as we move forward in this course, keep watching for how power operates, sometimes boldly, sometimes quietly, but always at the heart of global politics. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.